All right, Mr. Lucy, thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this project that we have here about the life and times of one Frederick O'Neill, a person who you worked with over the years in the area of labor. And just briefly, give us an idea of how you came to know Mr. O'Neill in labor, and how do you think the issue of labor from an actor's perspective got into the AFL-CIO?
Well, I think Mr. O'Neill really was a trade unionist who came along the same time as a lot of other great actors. Acting is probably one of the few places where you've got more unemployed people all the time than you have employed people. And that's probably the norm for just regular actors. But when it comes to black actors, given all the other dynamics around it, I think Mr. O'Neill brought a particular perspective to this issue. The question of quality parts, the question of regular work, the question of fair treatment, fair, decent contracts. I met Mr. O'Neill when he became a member of the Executive Council of the AFL-CIO. And those are the kinds of issues that just sort of found their way into the actors movement. He at that time was president of Actors Equity, an organization that represents just tremendously talented folk. But at the same time, black actors had their troubles just as a part of just having a meaningful career. I listened one time as Harry Belafonte talked about the struggles of actors, Cindy Poitier and others, trying to get decent parts, trying to get decent contracts, trying to get quality parts. And I think Fred came into the labor to advance that cause. Fred was a political activist as well. And the trade union gave him a platform to both carry on his career, to argue on behalf of decent treatment of actors, and at the same time be a force in the political life of the country.
Very good. Now, of course, Fred came along and being born like in the early 1900s, he had quite a different view of, relationships, race relations especially. How do you think that impacted his relations with the labor community as well as with black folks of your generation, which is a little bit, came a little bit later?
I think we have to look at the American labor movement as not as a monolithic movement. I mean, American labor at the time when Fred and a lot of others came along was really a very conservative movement designed to protect what you had as opposed to promoting what you need. And I think Fred sort of fell victim to that theory. While he continued to try and push the envelope, he was still caught in a network of unions who really saw their single issue as the central issue, and it didn't see the movement as a whole as a vehicle to improve the well-being of a broad slice of the American community. And Fred, I think, was one who tried to push that. And when I say he was a political activist, he had his own particular views about the kind of economy that we ought to have. And what the role of organized labor would be in that economy. And I think he played that out in his work within organized labor and on the social side of his activity.
So in saying that, the actors had a very specific niche that they were trying to negotiate. You said, trying to get good roles, trying to get responsible, kinds of regular work. How is that different from what you come out of as a trade unionist coming out of your organization?
Well, I come out of an environment where you're talking about full-time employment, year-round. I came out of the public sector. There are private sector workers, building and construction trades who work as the project proceeds. When it's over, then you got to start all over again looking for a new and different job. Actors, like I said, I mean, there are more actors unemployed all the time than there are working, simply because it's the nature of that industry. And if it's tough on all workers, it's doubly tough on African-American artists at that time. I assume they had a studio system where you were tied to a contract that had a contract with the studio that provided you a role. Well, if you're an African American actor, that makes life a little tough if they're not writing parts for you. And I think that was a hue and cry of a number of actors, including Fred O'Neill, from all of the what are stars now would have been saddled by that studio process.
Sure. And your union, tell us a little bit about your union, just for information.
I came out of the public sector. I was with the American Federation of State, County.
Okay. I'm sorry. Tell us about your union.
I came out of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. I was a public employee employed by Contra Costa County, which was a large government in California. I came out of the engineering side of the county employment. We built highways, bridges, dams, you name it. But our concept was we were civil service employees, hired by county government to carry out the function of government as it relates to infrastructure, as it related to maintenance of streets and highways. So we had a sense of security that was very much different than what many private sector employees would have, and certainly different than what actors would have. Our union at that time was relatively small in the 1930s. At the time I met Mr. O'Neill, we were probably about the 6th or 7th largest affiliate of the AFL-CIO. We now have, to give you some sense of it, in 1953, we had 275,000 members. By the time we reached the year 2000, we had 1,300,000. So all that growth in the public sector was because of, the public sector had to meet the needs of the general community. Our pay and benefits were fairly stable, but they were decided not by the collective bargaining process, but by civil service and merit systems, who was given the legal authority to decide these issues. And so our battle was to get access to a process that allowed us to participate in decisions that affected our work life. If I'm a truck driver for the city, why is that any different than a truck driver for a private company? I mean, the skill requirements are the same. So our argument was we ought to be able to bargain collectively just like any other set of workers. Yet we were specifically excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, and that was essentially our reason for being, to get equity and fairness for public sector workers.
Excellent. Now, Mr. O'Neill was seen basically as a trailblazer of his time. Would you say that he was considered forward-thinking, or progressive for his era? And subsequently, how do you think that played out?
I think Mr. O'Neill very much so was a progressive thinker for that time. And bear in mind, as I said earlier, the American labor movement is not a monolithic structure. Inside labor, Mr. O'Neill, as well as Mr. A. Philip Randolph and Mr. C.L. Dellum, had an incredibly difficult time trying to get labor as a institution to focus on the narrow issues that they brought to the table. Mr. Randolph and his Pullman car porters, Mr. Dellums, which was a part of the Seafaring, the Transportation Union, and Mr. O'Neill as a career actor. These are not the dominant parts of organized labor. So to try and get your issues on the table and attention addressed to them, it took more than just arguing the point. And I think Mr. O'Neill, and some of the ideas and concepts that he advanced in pursuit of that, demonstrated in the years that he was on the AFL-CIO Executive Council, he really made the case much broader than his industry he argued for. I mean, I think Fred was making the case that workers in general needs a movement that would argue for their advancement and empowerment so they can themselves deal with wages, hours, and conditions of employment. And that was a major undertaking for black workers at that time.
Yeah, the stress of that is probably difficult to appreciate at this time. This is 2014 we're talking about now. When you look at a person like Fred O'Neill and his accomplishments, do we have any idea of whether he got accused of being too left or too problematic for the culture, the United States culture at that time?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. And the accusation may not have come from labor, but it certainly came from government. Mr. O'Neill embraced somewhat of socialist thinking and was probably labeled by the J. Edgar Hoovers of that time as being too far out there, and probably paid a price for it. I mean, many of the actors, both black and white, fell into that situation, but it had much greater impact on black actors and artists. But Mr. O'Neill, I can't say he paid no attention to it because clearly it had an impact. But I think he continued to push the envelope to argue that labor and government had a very clear role in correcting some of the injustices and inequities that exist for the kind of people that he argued for.
Right. He was a champion for his folks. When the country decided to challenge some of the more progressive people in the country, the quote-unquote Red Scare with the McCarthy era, Fred O'Neill and some of his folks in the American Negro Theater got caught up in that. You know anything about that?
No, I'm not familiar with that, except that anybody who was not on the McCarthy side of that argument were labeled as on the wrong side. And I think any number of actors who were both independent thinkers as well as had political views about the role that government and business and labor and et cetera were addressing. I mean, he challenged folks to do right by a whole slice of America who had no other voice.
Sure. No, that's a great point. He went from having this problem with McCarthy to eventually being a part of the founding of the Office of Humanities and Culture for the United States, and was seen in photographs with Lyndon Johnson. What kind of political skill set do you think he had to do to pull that off? Because that doesn't seem to be too easy.
Well, I think Fred was as a thinker way ahead of his time. I think Paul Robeson had the same, I don't want to say difficulty, but the question of independent thinking in a career. That independent thinking really jeopardized your ability to earn a living and to project your goals. So to make a decision to be yourself, I thought was a rather heroic thing to do. I mean, you have the Cindy Poitiers and the Harry Belafontes and a whole host of just well-known actors who didn't buy into or bow down to sort of the political correctness of that time. And Fred was one of those, and he was unique in the sense that he carried out his role inside of organized labor with a platform of being president of Actors Equity.
Sure. You were a relative young person coming along in labor at the time. You had risen very, remarkably in the labor movement, and yet when you and Mr. O'Neill came to talk, you had maybe some generational differences of opinion or difference of opinion about process. Can you elaborate any on that?
I think, and it may have been misjudgment on my part, but Fred and so many others like him were convinced that the system, if given time, would do the right thing, would provide the right direction and the right approach to the problems that black folks in general were exposed to. I came into the labor movement in 1966 and didn't really experience many of the things that they had to grapple with. And for a lot of us, as Dr. King used to say, the fierce urgency of now. And we didn't see addressing the American labor movement or the executive council of the American labor movement as some holy process. I mean, here's we got a problem, this is a movement designed to focus on these problems. Let's do that. And I think Mr. O'Neill and others accepted the notion that they were in the room because of the kindness of those who own the room. We didn't hold that view. We saw ourselves as allies of the American labor movement, and particularly political allies. And if that was true, and it was, then we're entitled to be treated with the respect that partners treat each other with. I mean, we're not in the room as a supplicant. We're in the room as a full-fledged partner, because what we bring to the table and could bring more of is a stronger alliance between those who need the labor movement and those who have the responsibility of leading it.
That was true for the time, and it's still true now.
Still true now.
Do you think that our actors and our young performers now have benefited? You okay? Do you think our actors and our performers of this current era have benefited from the kind of things that Mr. O'Neill was struggling with?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. They absolutely have.
Okay, so incorporate that into your answer.
I think young actors and artists and performers and entertainers have truly benefited from Mr. O'Neill's work. He opened doors that had been closed forever, and then he kept doors open that had been open for some time. And I think it took somebody of his stature from the platform that he operated from as the head of Actors Equity to do these things. I think everybody had seen the experience of Paul Robeson and what happened to him, and others who followed in his footsteps. And he was able to do it and pave new directions. At the same time, there were folks able to take advantage of that. Current actors are, I mean, the dynamics have changed so drastically, from an economic point of view, from an organizational point of view. You've got young folks now who are able to take advantage of. Just a parallel example would be Muhammad Ali.
I'm sorry. Parallel example is where I coughed in there.
A parallel example would be Muhammad Ali, where prior to Ali, I mean, the fighters were owned by the promoters and what have you, and they were essentially employees. And Muhammad Ali changed the paradigm, where he became and they became, you know, the draw. And I think this was achieved by Fred on behalf of actors, entertainers, and what have you, which are now big stars beyond anyone's imagination.
So the challenge, of course, now is, from your perspective, what do we see being necessary for performers, actors, as, you know, people who need employment and need the kind of roles and things that Fred O'Neill fought for? What is their responsibility now?
Well, let me before answering that question, back up a little ways. Hollywood is not the Hollywood of the past. I mean, the studio system has been, best I can tell, diminished considerably. So has the personalities that have great sway in Hollywood. I mean, you now have black actors and actresses who command not only attention, but the big buck. And they are big economic centers in Hollywood. You know, the Will Smiths and all of that crowd who has just dramatically changed the way the entertainment industry functions, and particularly the movie industry. And I think, and I don't know it for a fact, but my guess is a good deal of that had to do with the groundwork laid by Mr. O'Neill in empowering people to demand, you know, more for their talents and their skills. I mean, we've got the Jay-Z's and Beyoncé's and folks who just have tremendous talent and therefore commands, tremendous compensation.
Sure. And the responsibility of the young folks, of course, a lot of them don't even know about Mr. O'Neill, which is a part of the reason for this process that we're going through now. But what do you see as responsibility for the young folks coming along?
I think folks coming along in his industry and others have a real responsibility to understand how they got where they are and what their responsibilities are to coming generations. And in saying that, our crowd, our young people really need to know about A. Philip Randolph. They really need to know about E.D. Nixon. They really need to know about all of the trade union leaders that helped the civil rights movement. They really need to know about the artists like Nat King Cole and Sammy Davis Jr. and all of those who risked their careers to advance the cause of civil rights and social justice. There are some that even if they know it, are not going to act any different. But the overwhelming majority focus, and I guess rightly so, at compensation for their skills, but they really need to know that there was somebody who blazed the trail for them.
That's so critical for making a whole person, because otherwise you feel that you don't owe anybody anything, and then the responsibility is on somebody else to lift themselves up next time.
Well, we've got artists, musicians who spend a lifetime fashioning good music, who die in poverty simply because they don't have either the skills or the support to help them capitalize on their work. The young people need to have a greater understanding of what it means to be talented. How does that play itself out in coming years? A few years ago, we worked on a program where artists who sang songs but didn't write songs, I mean, they were employees. They realized no profit, no royalty from all of the work that they did. And yet, you've got radio stations who live off the work that all these artists did. And so, I mean, there are a number of issues like this that it takes someone who is knowledgeable about the business to push those forward. And I think Fred, for the movie industry, did that. And even though there were some roles that he certainly would not play today if he was around and had an opportunity, but that was part of the price you paid for advancing your cause.
Your cause, sure. All right. I think that most of what I've came to ask has been asked. Tell me anything else you might want to say about Mr. O'Neill that I didn't ask you.
Well, I think Fred is one of those folks who just never get the credit for all that he did. He worked in an environment where 80% of the people don't even know they exist. By that I mean within the confines of labor. The average person has no knowledge of the American Federation of Labor, what it does and why it does it. And yet, it's clear that without labor as an institution, the whole question of our economic system is seriously imbalanced. And without labor, our social and our political system is out of balance. And I think for folks like Fred, and I keep coming back to C.L. Dellums and A. Philip Randolph, who saw labor as a vehicle to improve the quality of life of not just their members, but the broader community, they're really entitled to much more than just a footnote on the page. And what's so incredible, people like E.D. Nixon, the Montgomery bus boycott, all of those things, these were trade unionists who used their roles to help advance those causes. When folks look at the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, they did more than just serve food on trains. I mean, they were really the vehicles that moved the news, who helped people understand what was taking place in different places. And with this news cycle of today, people don't have to figure all that out. But we certainly would not be where we are today if not for the Fred O'Neills of the past.
Thank you, Mr. Lucy. You've been great.
My pleasure,
Thank
my
you,
pleasure.
sir. That was great. You okay, man?